Colorado is just a losing state right now when you look at how many DSA candidates actually emerged from some of their recent elections. Your thoughts generally when you approach this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty scary when we think about what's happening here with the rise of all these Democrat socialist candidates. And it reminds me of President Reagan's quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction." Mm. And this new brand of Democrat socialists, these are not just in favor of, Scandinavian-style social democracy with Medicare for all and free college and child care. I mean, they want to abolish ICE. They potentially want to get rid of prisons. It's increasingly anti-Semitic. We're talking extreme gender ideology and absolutely ruinous economic policies that would just crush hardworking American families. And I think that's why we see even Democrats themselves, Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman warning that they are becoming a, quote, an orgy of socialism. And he called the anti-ICE rhetoric plagues the dirtbag wing of the party, anti-American. And it's really scary what's happening here, and we have to think about what are the sources coming from this. And I think part of it is just the lack of historical understanding that a lot of younger generations have today.
I'm glad you brought that up too, Rachel. And you're of an age, and of course you've appeared before Congress. You've had these conversations of policy and how they affect our lives, whether it's in Washington D.C. or Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or Manchester, New Hampshire. But you're of an age too where you've seen a lot of your peers, maybe out of frustration, what they perceive to be the ills of an economy, or maybe the false ills of an economy, have turned more towards talking about socialism in a positive way. One, our education system has failed a lot of people and not helping them there. How do you generally talk with people of helping them understand the past failures of what we're hearing now on this conversation of socialism, communism?
Yeah, I think that it's understandable, first of all, to see that there are frustrations out there, and you look at things like the rising costs of housing, and a college education, and healthcare, and in many ways, those things do cost more than my parents had to pay for them. But actually, those are the areas in which we don't have a free market. We don't have an actual capitalist system going on. We have massive government intervention. And that's why healthcare has become so expensive. The federal government pays for 50 cents of every dollar in healthcare spending in the U.S. There is no healthcare market. We're subsidizing college education excessively with hundreds of billions of dollars, and at the same time, the returns that people are getting from those college educations are going down, so you're paying more to get less. And then when we look at housing, yes, it does seem unaffordable and is unaffordable in many areas, but not everywhere across the U.S. And this is really more of a local issue in dealing with things like how long it takes to get a permit and how much are your property taxes. I live in an area in the DMV, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, and when you compare, my taxes in Montgomery County, Maryland to an hour and a half away in more rural Virginia, it's 10 times as high.
Wow.
And so a lot of this actually should be better dealt with at the local level, but there are some definite realities to the struggles that Americans are facing, but more government intervention will only exacerbate those problems.
And once again, we're talking to Senior Research Fellow for Plymouth Institute for Free Enterprise. Of course, her expertise is workforce, family policy, and Social Security. Of course, Rachel Greszleron joins us as well. Rachel, which is interesting what you just said there. You really hit the three big points that seems to be the most impactful on especially those under the age of 40, where they feel government might help. You talk about healthcare, massive government intervention. You talk even about housing, massive government intervention, either through really schemed loan systems or also over-regulation. And then when you talk about education, once again, almost everything related to the cost of education, at least in the last 40 years, we've seen no greater cost of any kind of service than what we see from education, government influence. In that regard, do you think that are you hearing the countering message, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the Republican Party, but are you hearing the countering message from true conservatives who are able to explain those pain points correctly?
I think they can. It's more difficult, though, in today's, soundbite culture where you have to get your point across in 10 seconds to get somebody to step back and think through the economics and the processes of these that you need to understand. But that's where we need to have more discussion starting, in the lower levels of school about what are the actual economics of this. It can seem like, hey, I'm not getting what I want, and so maybe I need the government to be the solution to help. But never before in history have government promises been able to overcome economics, which is quite literally the study of how a society allocates scarce resources across unlimited demands, no matter what it is that you want, whether it's Medicare for all, college for all, childcare. The demands will go on and on and on, and you eventually run out of everybody else's money. And so the reality is yes, you want these particular three things, and you want somebody else to pay for them. But at the end of the day, there's not actually enough money out there. We could compensate the wealth of every millionaire and billionaire in the U.S., and it wouldn't be enough to pay for all of these Democrat socialist promises. So at the end of the day, are you actually willing to trade off having a lot less than the amount that you take home from your paycheck in order to have access to what the government decides should be benefits that are available to everybody? I think the actual Democrat socialist message is far scarier than European-style big government. But if we only want the European-style big government, then that's a trade-off. And lower and middle-class Americans will pay twice as much in taxes. The average worker in the U.S. Would pay $12,000 more across 22 European countries if they lived there. The average family of four would pay $22,000 more taxes in Europe than they do in the U.S. And that's just to get these, basic things like health care for all and child care.
And that's an interesting point, too. And I think, I don't know if you noticed this, that I think so many people are confused as to what socialism is. Karl Marx was very clear what socialism is. It's the peaceful introduction to communism until the force comes into play. He knew that if you stepped into socialism, he could get you to communism in the next global revolution as well. Do you think, I don't know when you first got educated in economics. I had to teach myself when I was younger. It wasn't until I got to the University of Chicago where I really immersed myself in understanding the economy even deeper. Do you think we do a good job in this country actually explaining these models to younger people?
No, we don't. And that's something that I largely had to learn on myself, too. And I'm glad that you brought up that it's just a step process, right? The ultimate end, you don't end with, quote, democratic socialism. You get to socialism to communism or authoritarianism. Winston Churchill said socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy.
Wow.
At the end of the day, it's not just like, I have these lovely benefits that I have access to if I want them and I don't have to pay for them. It's the government is in control of everything, and they decide what you get and you don't get. And I think, we should be looking more at differences between East Germany and West Germany.
Oh, yes,
and
thank you.
Your child going through the education system should be able to compare those things. It wasn't just that there were shortages and long lines. There's a surveillance state, monitoring everything that you do. And that's the end game of all this. And I think that we need to realize it's not, you never stop there, just as you said.
Well, that is so brilliant, Rachel. I'm so glad you brought that up. That is it's a real world case study in modern history of East Germany and of East Berlin and West Berlin. There's a great study out there on the stores and what happened to the typical grocery store in West Berlin and East Berlin when the wall went up. And they talk about mustard. And you had one choice in East Berlin, and over in West Berlin, you had 1,000 choices. And the consumer decided what direction to go in. And some Politburo in Moscow decided what mustard you got. I think that's a brilliant sense. So when we talk about advancing American freedom, you guys must get these questions a lot. You've got the experts out there. How are you guys trying to help counter this conversation, at least make people understand the dangers of, yes, communists can do TikTok videos. It doesn't make it any better.
Yes, and that's where we're trying to, just spread some education across many different levels, whether it's publishing reports or holding education sessions for Hill staffers, because there's a lot of young people on the Hill who are the ones that are helping their, bosses make these decisions. And so it's really important to provide that education across many levels. And I think that confronting, recognizing the problems and then putting a reality to this, your example there with the mustard. And I had a friend, former colleague who grew up in Germany, and she had a friend who was in East Berlin. And, every time that there were bananas, she just loved them because where she had grown up, there were long lines to get bananas. They were just this delicacy because there were always shortages of them. And so to this day, she said that people see a line and they're like, oh, do they have bananas? But we don't, nobody realizes like, hey, I would actually have to wait in this really long line just to get this basic thing now that I could go to the store and get for 30 cents. And so to bring to reality, what life is actually like in those places that were truly socialist or truly communist, I think that would help educate children and just have them think twice about the decisions in the end game of what it is that they're being, courted into.
Yeah, and I highly encourage, if any parent does get a chance to go to Europe with their children, go to the what used to be the east side of East Berlin and go to the Museum on the Stasi, which was the state police force, and how they had neighbors turn against neighbors and family turn against friends. It is horrific, and it's just not an economic oppression. It is an oppression of liberty as well. Hey, Rachel, it's always a pleasure when we get a chance to chat with you. This is the free-form part of our interview. You can say whatever you want on any topic that you want, or just kind of make a conclusion. Your final thoughts?
Well, I would like to be optimistic about this. At the end of the day, socialism doesn't work, and what doesn't work will not prevail, and it never has prevailed throughout history. That's not to say that there won't be extreme consequences along the way, but I would love for us to look more to history and to be guided by that. When you see places like California wanting to enact a wealth tax and say, oh, look at Europe. They've had 12 countries that have tried to do that, and you know what? They repealed them because it doesn't work. And so if we could just look more to the actual realities of what has and has not worked over time, I think we would be doing a better service. And that's where we can come in, Advancing American Freedom and other organizations like ours that are just trying to provide some education to guard against these really dangerous ideas that are out there.
And plus, you have access to people on the Hill, and I think that's an important task that you guys as well do. We just have to get a T-shirt of Rachel going, what could happen?